Welcome to Long Covid Doctor, an educational series for sufferers of long Covid. I'm Dr. Tim Robinson, formerly a family doctor, GP for 30 years, now GP lead for 3 NHS Long Covid clinics, and a GP clinical lead in Long Covid across the southwest of England. This episode is on anxiety and Long Covid. In part 1, I talk about the symptoms, diagnosis and causes. And in part 2, I'll talk about the treatments, management and outcomes. Check out the references, resources and links to social media in the show notes below if you should so wish. Just to say, any advice, diagnoses, treatments that I mention should only be considered after discussion with your own doctor or medically qualified health professional. And so, here we go. Anxiety and Long Covid. So firstly, the context, the background. Anxiety in Long Covid is common. In my experience in the 3 Long Covid clinics I work in, it is extremely common and it has a great impact on our patients. This may be the worsening of previous anxious tendency or a completely new anxiety, never had it before. But it's here now, purely due to having Long Covid. And so firstly, what exactly is anxiety? Anxiety is a feeling of unease, such as worry or fear. Anxiety is a normal response to a situation in which we feel threatened or at risk of harm, physically or mentally. This is normal. But some people find it hard to control their worries. The anxiety feelings become more constant and impact on everyday life. This is generalized anxiety disorder. The anxiety response is known as the fight or flight response through the involuntary release of adrenaline and other stress hormones such as cortisol. Other neurotransmitters involved in anxiety disorders are serotonin, the happy chemical, GABA, the calming chemical, and others. It's complicated. The areas in the brain involved in anxiety are the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, and the limbic system is there are a number of sections of the limbic system, but the 2 areas that are particularly involved in anxiety are the hippocampus, responsible for short-term memories, and the amygdala, the area where there are fear responses and frightening memories are laid down. And then the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain, where conscious thoughts and responses are made. So these areas are connected and send impulses everywhere around the body. So how does anxiety present itself? So basically, anxiety symptoms can be divided into those that are physical and those that are mental. So firstly, the physical symptoms. Those may be fatigue, dizziness, muscle aches, palpitations, dry mouth, faintness, clamminess, trembling, shortness of breath, headache, pins and needles. Many symptoms familiar to Long Covid. So if you've got those symptoms with your anxiety and you've also got those symptoms with your Long Covid, in a way you're getting a double dose of those symptoms. Not good. And then that's the physical side. Then what about the mental symptoms? The mental symptoms are symptoms like restlessness, difficulty concentrating, irritability, feeling constantly on edge, a sense of dread or fear, and sleep disturbance. Fear may extend into a number of other conditions, such as panic disorder, so panic attacks. Fear may extend into PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that's caused by very frightening or distressing event, leading to flashbacks or nightmares. that are embedded in the amygdala, that part of the limbic system I was explaining. So, such as patients who have been on ventilators and intensive care units during their acute COVID, those memories may come back to haunt them. Another manifestation of fear is in social phobia. So patients fear going out. It's just more than basic shyness. It's a fear of social situations. Another aspect of anxiety is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviours. And then finally, there's depression. There's a crossover between anxiety and depression. So anxiety may progress into depression, and I saw this many a time during my years in general practice. And depression, basically is that mental state in which you feel sad, flat, down. These feelings become extreme with sort of total hopelessness and complete despair, thoughts of self-harm or even suicidal thoughts. So these are the red flag symptoms of depression. And obviously these must be taken extremely seriously. So if a patient does, or you feel those symptoms, seek advice urgently through your GP. So basically anxiety in general, including in long COVID, can present with some or all of those features, some of all of those mental and physical symptoms. So how does anxiety interfere with long COVID recovery? When someone is calm, relaxed, balanced, restorative repair processes are not at their optimal. So if they're not calm and relaxed, balanced, those processes are not working most efficiently. So therefore, they're not working at their best capacity. And this, of course, is not ideal while you're trying to recover from long COVID. And so anxiety will contribute to the exacerbation and perpetuation of those after effects of long COVID. You find yourself going around in circles, further fueling the anxiety, further embedding the anxiety and the negative thought processes, and further complicating and adding to the already complex condition known as long COVID. Sort of a downward spiral occurring here. So what are the causes for anxiety and long COVID? Why do people with long COVID get anxiety? So as we know, long COVID is complicated. It's a complex condition with multiple causes, dysregulations, dysfunctions. All symptoms result from many possible causes and explanations, not just one cause, one explanation, unfortunately. And this applies to anxiety and long COVID also. So, getting to it now, what are the possible causes of anxiety and long COVID? Well, there are the effects of long COVID on the brain itself. The autonomic nervous system may be affected, the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, that balance. There may be effects on the HPA axis, the limbic system, the brainstem, and sleep. So going through them, as I said, effects on the autonomic nervous system, you get stuck in that fight and flight mode, the adrenaline charged because of excessive sympathetic nervous system response. Then there's disruption of the HPA axis. HPA stands for hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis. Studies show that there's reduced cortisol levels as a result of this disruption of the HPA axis, i.e. reduce cortisol levels, reduce stress response. And then there's disruption of the neural pathways from the hypothalamus to the pineal gland. Therefore, there's reduced melatonin production. Melatonin, the hormone that is produced from the pineal gland, which is our body's natural sleeping sedative, sleeping pill. And then there's disruption of the limbic system. Already touched on this, the hippocampus and the amygdala in the limbic system. So there's poor emotional processing and hence an anxiety tendency. And finally, the last effect in the brain is the disruption of signaling in the brainstem itself, the brainstem nuclei. So you're going to have associated symptoms such as nausea, pain, sickness behavior response, and sleep dysfunction. So all those things can occur in long COVID, and all of those things will contribute to that sort of imbalance and hence anxiety. And then in long COVID, you've got the effects of long COVID on the gut. So gut dysbiosis, your friendly gut flora are disturbed. So this is well documented in long COVID studies. And as a consequence, there is a reduction in the production of the neurotransmitter chemicals, such as serotonin. I mentioned this earlier. So 90% of serotonin is produced in the intestinal cells, the lining of the intestines. So serotonin is the happy hormone. So there's less of it being produced. And there was a recent paper that demonstrated this very nicely. Likewise, GABA, the calming hormone, that there's reduced production of GABA. And this may contribute to the tendency for anxiety and also depression, both of which also have sleep disturbance as part of its symptomatology. And then the effects of long COVID on the whole body balance and harmony. So that interrelationship of all the systems is upset. The immune system, the anti-inflammatory system, the autonomic system, the hormonal system, they all talk to each other. They're all interconnected. So long COVID brings about a disruption of that balanced interconnection and harmony of those systems. Explanation, all those causes, all those disruptions could be a result of multiple reasons. So as we know with long COVID, as I said, it's multi-system, multi-causal. So there's the inflamed blood vessels, endothelialitis, there's excessive inflammatory response, and that includes excessive mast cell activation, microclot formation, there's autoimmune activation, all leading to nerve cell damage in the brain as well as around the peripheral nervous system. All this is happening in long COVID to varying degrees, resulting in multiple long COVID symptoms, but including anxiety. So I've covered all those causes of anxiety in long COVID in detail for an important reason. It's really important for our patients, for you, to know that their long COVID anxiety is not just due to the effect it is having on their mood and their life, their smashed hopes and dreams, and the effects on them personally, their family, their financial status, etc. There is plenty of evidence that explains that anxiety in long COVID is due to physical reasons. There are physical reasons that explain long COVID anxiety. It's certainly not all in the head. It's not imagined, despite what the skeptics and gaslighters are saying. This validation helps with the acceptance of the situation for those sufferers of long COVID, which I think is really an important part of the long COVID recovery. However, at the same time, having said all that, it must also be acknowledged that worries about long COVID are understandable, totally justified. It's only natural. And they will, of course, contribute to all those physical causes of long COVID anxiety. And I've divided those worries up into 3 groups. Firstly, the worries about living with long COVID. It is taking longer to get better than you'd expect. It's taking extra long. It's almost like long COVID. There are the worries that, has someone missed something? So in a way, it's a case of, maybe we're having a difficulty with accepting the diagnosis. And there are those worries attached to sort of the fact that despite doing all the things that your long COVID clinic and all your research into how to deal with long COVID, despite all those and putting those into action, it's still not getting better. Plus, there are the worries generated from all the conflicting information online. You may well have tried it all, but nothing seems to work. That leads to further worry. Why isn't it working? Plus, the worry about the expense of any treatments that you might have bought online. Patients, do tend to take the stack of supplements and vitamins and minerals, etc., and it all adds up. And then, talking expense, what about the expense of investigations online? A lot of patients are, sending stool samples off to look at their microbiome. They're going to private clinics to have blood tests or food intolerance testing, many of them leading to further confusion and doubt, and dubious dietary advice and unnecessary expensive supplementation again. This all leads to false beliefs and uninformed explanations of symptoms that can cause them to be reinforced, as can suspicions or blame directed at the medical profession. The internet has many sources of information that can be misleading and based on pseudoscience, and all of this can further reinforce anxiety symptoms. Plus, some patients repeatedly check symptoms, obsessively almost, as well as seek reassurance due to distrust of maybe professionals. This can lead to further anxiety. And then there are the disappointments with the progress by the medical profession. After all, it's like 3 years, it's coming on 4 years now, that they, patients understandably are saying, my gosh, 3-4 years, why do we still not really have any answers, any active pinpointing treatments? Surely they can fix it. So many worries, so many concerns, leading patients down so many rabbit holes and anxieties. And finally, besides all those worries, there are the worries about the consequences that long COVID is having on the individual patient, the effects on that person, that they're not getting better, effects on the family and the friendships, effects on their work, they can't work, financial effects. Am I going to lose my job? I've heard that many a time. Am I going to lose my house? Again, likewise. The effects of, the patient saying, things like, my life has been robbed, my hopes and dreams have been smashed. As I said before, these are all totally understandable worries, stresses and fears, maybe leading to anxiety and depression. And further to this, other anxieties might be that, specific symptoms that our patients are having, that are long COVID symptoms, such as joint pains. Patients ask, is this arthritis? Am I going to be in a wheelchair? Or headaches, have I got a brain tumour? Palpitations and chest pain. When patients ask, is this heart disease? Am I going to have a heart attack? Breathlessness, by simply walking up one flight of stairs. I used to run marathons, they say. Why? Why is this so extreme? Why isn't it settling? Pins and needles, I've had patients say, pins and needles, is this multiple sclerosis? And sleep problems and change of bowel habit and a fear of soiling themselves. All these symptoms add to the whole burden of anxiety and worries. And it's all totally understandable. So there it is. That's anxiety and the causes of long COVID anxiety. It's really complicated. So one person may have one of those processes, either physical or mental or both, going on. So that's what's happening. That's what's called long COVID anxiety. It's important to know all those causes, as I said earlier, to help to understand and help, hopefully, to accept it. But what's more important is, what are we going to do about it? I'll come on to that, the treatment, the management of long COVID anxiety in part 2. So that concludes part 1 of my talk on anxiety and long COVID, the symptoms, diagnoses, and all those causes. I hope you found it helpful. Check out the references and resources and links to social media in the show notes below. As I mentioned at the start, any advice, diagnoses, treatments that I mention or have mentioned should only be considered after discussion with your own doctor or medically qualified health professional. So in the meantime, I wish you well. Wish you well with your long COVID recovery. And hopefully we'll meet in the second part. Cheerio.